The dark origins of civilization, when words became weapons. What if the moment humanity became civilized was actually the moment we learned to hide our violence, not eliminate it? What if every polite conversation, every carefully worded critique, every constructive feedback is just a spear we've learned not to throw? Sigmund Freud believed he knew the exact moment civilization began, and it wasn't what you think. The birth of civilization, a curse instead of a spear. Who founded civilization? Ask most people, and they'll tell you about the first cities, the first laws, the invention of agriculture or writing. But Freud saw deeper. According to him, civilization didn't begin with construction. It began with restraint. The founder of civilization wasn't the first person to build a city or establish a government. It was the person who first used a curse instead of throwing a spear. The person who, in a moment of rage, chose to wound with words rather than weapons. That split second when humanity learned to transform physical violence into verbal violence. That's when we stopped being animals and became something far more complicated. Think about what happened in that moment. A fundamental shift occurred in human nature. The impulse remained the same. The anger, the desire to hurt, the need to dominate. But its expression changed. Violence didn't disappear. It just put on a disguise. It learned to wear the mask of civilization. Violence didn't die. It went underground. When violence transformed into words, when the impulse to strike became the impulse to insult, we didn't become less violent. We became more sophisticated in our cruelty. The aggression didn't evaporate into thin air. It went underground, became subtle, learned new tricks. It transformed into sarcasm that draws blood without leaving marks, into passive aggression that punishes while maintaining plausible deniability, into psychological manipulation that destroys from the inside out. Did violence really disappear? Or did it just become invisible? This is the uncomfortable question Freud forces us to ask. Are we actually less violent than our ancestors who threw spears and swung clubs? Or have we simply developed more sophisticated, harder to detect forms of violence? Forms that are actually more insidious because they're harder to identify and impossible to prove? The physical blow is obvious. Everyone can see it. Society condemns it. Laws punish it. But what about the cutting remark delivered with a smile? The psychological abuse disguised as concern? The systematic undermining of another person's confidence wrapped in the language of love or friendship? These forms of violence are often completely invisible to outside observers. Sometimes they're even invisible to the victims themselves, who only know that somehow, inexplicably, they feel smaller, weaker, less than they were before. The wounds we cannot see. Civilization taught us to wound with words instead of weapons, and we congratulate ourselves on this progress. We've evolved, we say. We're better than our primitive ancestors. But are we? The truth is, the wounds inflicted by words are often deeper and harder to heal than physical injuries. A broken bone mends. A bruise fades. But the psychological damage from years of verbal abuse, from being systematically told you're worthless, from having your reality denied and your experiences invalidated, that damage can last a lifetime. It becomes part of your internal architecture, the lens through which you see yourself and the world. Perhaps civilization's greatest trick was convincing us that invisible violence isn't really violence at all. Family, the nest of damage. If you want to understand why people are broken, Freud would say, look at their families. Not because families are inherently evil, but because they operate according to a strange and tragic principle that most people never recognize. The damaged center. Family life, that institution we romanticize in greeting cards and idealize in our imaginations, organizes itself around a dark gravitational center, the most damaged member of the family. Not the healthiest person, not the most successful, not the wisest or strongest. The most broken person becomes the sun around which everyone else orbits, their needs and dysfunctions determining the family's entire dynamic. Think about the families you know. Really think about them. Isn't there always someone, The alcoholic father, the narcissistic mother, the troubled child, the unstable sibling, whose problems dominate everything. Every conversation revolves around them. Every decision considers their needs first. The healthy members twist themselves into pretzels trying to manage, appease, or fix the broken one. The entire family system reorganizes itself to accommodate one person's pathology. This isn't conscious. Nobody sits down and decides, let's make our family life revolve around the most dysfunctional person. It just happens organically, inevitably. Damage has gravity. It pulls everything toward it. The sins of the parents. Here's where Freud's insight becomes truly disturbing. If parents are in constant conflict, if they maintain an unhappy marriage for the sake of the children or for appearances, they're not protecting anyone. They're not being noble or self-sacrificing. They're preparing the ground for their children to develop nervous disorders, psychological problems, and relationship difficulties that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. Every fight witnessed becomes a template for conflict. Every tension felt becomes an expectation that intimacy equals pain. Every moment of unhappiness absorbed becomes part of the child's psychological architecture, the foundation upon which they'll build their entire understanding of love, safety, and human connection. Children are exquisitely sensitive instruments. They register everything: the things said, the things unsaid, the tension in a room, the false brightness in their mother's voice, the way their father's jaw clenches. They may not understand what they're witnessing, but they feel it all, and those feelings become beliefs about how the world works, how relationships function, how much pain is normal and acceptable. Inheritance beyond DNA. Perhaps every family produces its own unique pathology, its own signature pattern of damage that gets passed down through generations like an heirloom nobody wants, but everyone receives. This is the real family inheritance, not just genetic traits and physical features, but psychological wounds, dysfunctional patterns, unhealed traumas. The anxious parent, constantly worried and never at peace, raises an anxious child who will spend their life waiting for disaster. The angry parent, explosive and unpredictable, raises either an angry child who perpetuates the cycle or an excessively compliant one who learned that survival means invisibility. The distant parent, emotionally unavailable and withholding, raises a child who will struggle with intimacy forever, always keeping others at arm's length because closeness learned to equal abandonment. We don't just inherit our parents' DNA. We inherit their psychological wounds, their defense mechanisms, their ways of being in the world, both the healthy ones and the toxic ones. Often especially the toxic ones, because those are the patterns that help them survive, and survival strategies get transmitted most reliably. When home isn't safe, the family isn't always the safe haven we desperately want it to be. Sometimes, often, it's the place where damage originates. The first wound, the original trauma. The seeds of future neuroses are planted in childhood homes, watered by dysfunction, and cultivated into the problems that will plague someone for decades. Children learn their first and most fundamental lessons about life in their families. If those lessons are about fear, about chaos, about conditional love and unpredictable anger, about walking on eggshells and never feeling safe, those become the operating instructions for an entire life. They'll spend decades, possibly their entire existence, try to unlearn patterns that were carved into their psyches before they had any choice in the matter. If they ever manage to unlearn them at all. The dark architecture of the mind. The iceberg, what lies beneath. The mind is like an iceberg, Freud said, and this metaphor has become so famous that we forget how truly disturbing its implications are. Only 1/7 of an iceberg is visible above water. The rest, 6/7 of its massive bulk, lies hidden beneath the surface in the dark depths where you cannot see it. Now apply this to yourself. Only a tiny fraction of your mental life is actually conscious, accessible to your awareness. The rest, the vast, overwhelming majority of who you are, operates in darkness, beneath the surface of consciousness. This hidden portion is what Freud called the unconscious, and here's the terrifying part. It's running the show. Think about what this really means. Most of your thoughts, feelings, memories, desires, and motivations are operating completely outside your awareness. They're influencing your behavior in ways you don't recognize and couldn't control even if you did recognize them. All those decisions you think you're making rationally, all those careful deliberations, all that reasoning and weighing of options, you think you're the captain of your ship, standing at the helm, making conscious choices about where to sail. But Freud says you're not even on the deck. You're in a small cabin with a tiny window, getting occasional glimpses of where you're going, while the real navigation happens in the engine room far below, operated by forces you can't see and don't understand. The delusion of self-knowledge. Perhaps thinking you know yourself is your greatest delusion. You know only the tip of the iceberg, the small, presentable, socially acceptable self that you show to the world and, more importantly, to yourself. It's your public relations department, the carefully curated version of you that you can live with. But the rest? The bulk of who you actually are? That remains mysterious, unknowable, operating according to its own logic in the darkness beneath consciousness. And that hidden part doesn't care about your self-image, your values, or your carefully constructed identity. It has its own agenda, its own desires, its own methods of getting what it wants. This is why people constantly surprise themselves, why they do things they swore they'd never do, why they react in ways they don't understand and can't explain, why intelligent people make obviously self-destructive choices, why we repeat patterns we consciously hate, why we sabotage the things we consciously want. It's not because people are hypocrites or liars, though they often are both. It's because the conscious self, the you that you think is in charge, isn't actually in charge at all. The unconscious is running things, and it's perfectly comfortable keeping you in the dark about its operations. Who's really in control? If this is true, and Freud spent his life proving it was, then who are you really? Are you the conscious self that seems to be making decisions? Or are you the unconscious force that's actually pulling the strings? Or are you somehow both, a divided self at war with itself, neither side fully in control, neither side fully aware of what the other is doing? This is one of the most unsettling implications of Freudian psychology. You're not a unified self. You're more like a committee or a parliament, with different members who don't always communicate, often have opposing agendas, and only one of whom, consciousness, is even aware that the committee exists. Neurosis, the disease of uncertainty. What is neurosis, really? What is neurosis? That word Freud used constantly, and that's now largely fallen out of fashion. At its core, neurosis is something everyone can relate to, the inability to tolerate uncertainty. It's the desperate, consuming need to know, to control, to predict, to eliminate all ambiguity from existence. The neurotic person cannot sit comfortably with not knowing. They need answers. They need certainty. They need guarantees that the universe simply cannot and will not provide. They build elaborate systems of thought and behavior designed to create the illusion of control over an essentially uncontrollable reality. And here's the deeply uncomfortable truth that Freud identified. The modern world is absolutely saturated with uncertainty. It's the water we swim in, the air we breathe. Uncertainty is everywhere about everything all the time, living in a world without guarantees. We don't know if our relationships will last. We don't know if our jobs are secure. We don't know if our investments will pay off, if our health will hold, if our plans will work out, if the people we love will still be here tomorrow. We don't know if what we're doing matters, if we're making the right choices, if we're good people or secretly terrible ones. Uncertainty isn't an occasional visitor in contemporary life. It's the fundamental condition of existence. There are no guarantees. There never were, but in the modern world, we can't even pretend there are. All the old certainties, religion, tradition, social hierarchies, clear life paths, have dissolved, leaving us floating in a sea of infinite possibility and zero certainty. Are we all neurotic now? So by Freud's definition, are we all neurotic now? Are we all struggling with an inability to tolerate the uncertainty that defines modern life? Perhaps neurosis isn't an aberration anymore, some rare disorder that afflicts the unfortunate few. Perhaps it's become the norm, not a disease, but the default condition of humans try to live in a world that offers no certainties while our psyches desperately, frantically crave them. Look at the symptoms: anxiety, compulsive behaviors, the need to constantly check and recheck, the inability to make decisions, the paralysis that comes from too many options, the exhaustion of trying to control the uncontrollable, the elaborate rituals people develop, checking their phones, counting things, organizing and reorganizing, all attempt to create order in chaos, to impose certainty on uncertainty. The impossible solution. The healthy response to uncertainty isn't to eliminate it. That's impossible, and trying to do so is what creates neurosis. The healthy response is to develop the capacity to live with it, to function despite not knowing, to act without guarantees, to make choices while accepting that you'll never have enough information to be certain you're choosing correctly. But that's extraordinarily, almost impossibly difficult. It requires tolerating the fundamental anxiety of existence without numbing it, avoiding it, or trying to control it away. Which is why so many of us develop elaborate defense mechanisms, compulsions, obsessions, and anxieties, all desperate attempts to create an illusion of control in an uncontrollable world. We're all trying to build little islands of certainty in an ocean of chaos. And we're all, to varying degrees, failing. The bitter truths of relationships. The platonic friendship question. Here's one of Freud's most controversial claims, one that many people reject immediately and instinctively. No man wants to be close friends with a woman he doesn't want to be with sexually. Every male-female friendship, according to Freud, has an undercurrent of sexual attraction or sexual possibility, even if it's completely unacknowledged, even if both parties would vehemently deny it, even if it never becomes conscious or explicit. Does this mean genuine platonic friendship between men and women is impossible? That's the uncomfortable implication Freud leaves us with. Or perhaps it means something slightly more nuanced, but equally disturbing. That these relationships always operate with a hidden dimension, a layer of attraction or possibility that neither party acknowledges but both are dimly aware of, like a song playing in another room that you can't quite hear but know is there. The unacknowledged complexity. This doesn't necessarily mean every male-female friendship is doomed or dishonest. It doesn't mean people are lying when they claim their friendship is purely platonic. But it does suggest that these relationships operate with a complexity that we often refuse to acknowledge, a complexity that makes them fundamentally different from same-sex friendships. There's always a question lurking beneath the surface, even if neither person ever asks it aloud, even if neither person consciously thinks it. Could this be something more? And that question, even unasked and unanswered, shapes the relationship in subtle ways. It affects boundaries, creates a particular kind of tension, introduces an element of possibility or impossibility that colors every interaction. Perhaps the intensity that can develop in opposite-sex friendships, the feeling that they're somehow more charged or significant than same-sex ones, comes from this unacknowledged undercurrent. Or perhaps Freud was simply wrong, projecting his own psychology onto everyone else. But the question remains, if he was right, what does it mean about the relationships we treasure as purely platonic? The weight of Freud's vision. Freud didn't offer us comfort. He didn't reassure us that we're good people, that our families love us, that civilization is progress, that we know ourselves, that we're in control of our lives. Instead, he held up a mirror and showed us something disturbing. Creatures who don't know themselves, controlled by forces they can't see, damaged by the families that raised them, living in denial about the violence they still carry, desperately trying to impose certainty on an uncertain world, and fundamentally alone despite all their relationships. Is this vision true? Partially true? Distorted by Freud's own neuroses and the particular pathologies of Victorian Vienna? Perhaps the answer matters less than the questions he forces us to ask. Who are you? Really? What's controlling your behavior? Where did your wounds come from? What violence are you still carrying? And are you brave enough to look beneath the surface of consciousness and see what's actually there? Most people aren't. And perhaps that's the most Freudian observation of all.